Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. أما بعد. This is the Alhamdulillah second day of Dhul Hijjah. On the 23rd day of July 2020. And of course, this is 1441. After this month is over, the Hajj season, then we'll be, inshallah, if we live to see Al-Muharram, will mark 1442, years after the migration of the Prophet ﷺ, or after the Islamic event of Al-Islam. Tonight, inshallah, tabarak wa ta'ala, this is normally our night for social issues. I have a combination of things, and they are related. And one of them has to do with women as it relates to history and those ladies that were from African dynasties, and on top of that, they were very instrumental as it relates to those societies, and they are queens from the African countries. Some of them worked alongside of their husbands who were kings. Some of them worked alongside of their husbands, not only as a queen of that king, but as his secretary of state, and then others were instrumental in legacies such as prophecy and the likes of fighting and warfare, physically warriors. And some of them also have connections with fighting off those people that want to not only fight against them and conquer them, but they also freed slaves, as we know the whole issue of slavery in African continents. We also want to talk about their contributions, because this is something that is very important as we talk modern day era as it relates to women of African American descent or African descent. It's very important to know that women have made a great contribution to societies on a large and on a global scale. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in the Hadith in Sahih Bukhari, on the authority of Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Lan yuflaha qawman," that the people will not be successful, lo amarahum amra'atan aw kama qala, so as long as their leader is a woman. And this could be understood in many ways. It could be understood in many ways. As again, we're going to bring a number of queens that they were successful in many ways. And one particular from amongst them fought for maybe 30 years or so against the Portuguese, subhanAllah, physically, with her army, and so we know that the Prophet ﷺ, he spoke the truth. He's a prophet and messenger of Allah. And it could be understood as it relates to that society the Prophet was talking about, because some things were privy to that society that he was in. It was not known that the woman would fight in warfare or be in charge from the Arabs. And we understand that, as they were the same people that from their culture was to at one time bury the young girls alive. You know, so it could have been from a standpoint um, of his people. As the Prophet ﷺ, he also mentioned in the hadith that's similar, when you talk about the meaning could be general or particular, where he mentioned jildatahum hum min jildatina, nam, whom they are men jildatina. And the ulama, when they explained this thing, because he was talking about a certain people who would claim they're following his way, but they would not be following the way. They would bring a different way. And he was talking about the people that would claim that something was from the practice of the Prophet, from his sunnah, but it would be another way, another sunnah. And so in that hadith, he mentioned their characteristics, and then he was asked by the narrator, about them in more detail, and the Prophet said, "Hum min jildatina." And so jildatina, the scholars of hadith, they said two things. One, either he was talking about they're from the Arab, jildatina, from our people, jildatina, which jild really means skin, but the way he used it, he's talking about from a race, or a tribe, or from a people, that, or from his people, which they were the Arabs. And then some said, or jildatina could mean, generally speaking, they're from Bani Adam. So the point that I'm making is not far-fetched when the Prophet said people will never be successful. So as long as they have a lady as their leader, he could have been talking about amongst the Arabs, because we see and we'll bring how women were successful from African queens. And we know that Aisha asked and complained about, why do the men get all of the reward? They have the issue of jihad, they have the issue of dawah, they have the issue of all of these things, such as prophethood, like we don't have nothing, as women. And so the Prophet said to her, you all, women's jihad, your struggle, your fight, your striving is considered when you make the Hajj. But we also know in the history, after the Prophet died, who was the leader of a great army? Aisha. And of course, some could say, well, his hadith referred to her, and it was general because she lost in the battle, and that she was sent back to her people rather than being taken as a right hand possessed, because she was from the wives of the Prophet and the mothers of the believer. But the point is that there are some benefits in that whole issue, just as there are some benefits in this issue of 10 of the ladies who were mentioned that were from queens in the African history. And then we will also mention just some of the issue of how Muslims contributed when it came to the issue of African civilization, because many people think that the Africans have no connection with Islam, and they try to wipe away Islam from the history of Africa and its people. And also we'll talk a little bit about how some of those same Africans that came here, they were not only non-Muslims, because they try to paint that picture too, that all of the slaves came here were non-Muslims, so they can say because the Muslims were sending people here as slaves. But no, Muslims were sent here as well. And as Dr. Shaikh Abdul Hakim Quick and others from the historians, it said 15 to 20 to 30% of the people that came here from the Africans that were in the what will be called Atlantic slave trade, they were Muslims. And this is now mentioned and taught um, in the African universities where they teach African history. So times have changed, and it's easy to do more research with technology, and we praise Allah. So, inshallah, tabarak wa ta'ala, we try to get underway, and hopefully we can finish this, inshallah ta'ala. Queen Nefertiti. Queen Nefertiti. And this, yani, is not in any political order necessarily. I took this from a research uh, on the YouTube, and it's also in some books. I listened to documentaries to verify it. But the person picked, in an order based on not just popularity, but the issue of strength, courage, um, also beauty, and the political gain. So Queen Nefertiti, this queen, if we start from number 10 and work our way up, she herself is is a um, a queen that had a lot of power and influence. And this is some of the things that when people write about these characters and these queens, they focus on, because some people might have less influence, some people might have less power. Many of them were beautiful, and physical beauty as well as character. So this is why she's listed at number 10, because other people ranked higher than her as it relates to power and issue of um, influence and beauty. She was a queen that she was very the dynasty of old, what we would call Egypt, and she was instrumental in helping getting rid of the worship that they had in Egypt of the different gods, and helping the people focus and change to a worship of the creator of the heavens and the earth. And we will say that these were people of Tawheed of her time, for example. And this is as a great thing that a woman queen not only had power, but she had that type of power, because that's hard to rid people from their different gods and goddess like this they have been doing for thousands of years. And he, meaning her husband, he was part of that scenario, but she was the one that uh, uh, she was the one that advanced it, pushed it, supported him, and they because of the issue of politics, they give most of the credit to him. But you'll find when you research that she was a big part of this, Queefet Nefertiti. And after they uh, established this, then of course there became a religious revolution, which is warfare. And this is, aside from the 25th dynasty of the Nubian king. So this is Queen number 10, Nefertiti, who helped liberate the people from all of the different gods and goddesses, along with her husband in Old Egypt. And of course, they said she was well known for her beauty. So that's a given. Queen Goody came in at number 9. Queen Goody. Unlike Queen Nefertiti, yani Queen Goody, number 9 is, not as popular, but she's in the history books. And that's due to Western scholars, trying to wipe her, clean from the history or ignore her. So that's why she's not as popular, Queen Goody. She was what's considered a Jewish queen, a legendary black Jewish queen, and she's actually from the southern part of Ethiopia, which is called the Sadama people. So she has a great history as it relates to being in that area. And she was instrumental in destroying the empire of her time. And this was in northern Ethiopia, where she had destroyed churches, she burned churches, uh, she destroyed monuments, and this was just shy of eliminating the whole royal family of that time. This Queen Gudi, and you can find people in Ethiopia, especially in the countryside, they still talk about her to this day. Now, and you have something called written history and oral history. So she's more popular in oral history than written history. And the great scholar Ibn Aqil, who was a Muslim scholar, they will call him in their writings Arab scholar, because this is how they classify. But we know Ibn Aqil was not only an Arab scholar, he was from the ulama of al-Islam. He wrote about her, and he talked about Queen Gudi. And he just mentioned that, this country of Habashia, they call it Habasha, but it's really Habasha. He said it has been ruled by a lady for many years. He was talking about Queen Gudi. Now, and she was, during that time, responsible for the assassination of the king, which, we said warfare. So imagine, women were involved to this extent. Now, and you talk about number 8, then this is the Queen Amina is number 8. Queen Amina, number 8. Queen Amina was from the people of West Africa, the Hausa people. And the Hausa people, they are considered to be in northern Nigeria, but that's still considered a part of. It's close to West Africa when you talk about being close to Ghana and those areas. And some of the people said that Queen Amina was the first queen to bring about civilization to the people of Nigeria amongst the Hausa people. And they give her props for military exploits and making the Hausa rules and regulations like their constitution or their bios, which they lived in, helped them to become civilized, and also building the what would be considered the Hausa wall to protect people from coming from the outside inside of the area. She was instrumental in building that as well. That's Queen Amina. Now, so this is something we could talk about protection, to build a wall. This is an old historical way of protecting your land. Now, Number seven, number seven, Amanchetto, Queen Amanchetto, which is from the Queen Amatachetto. Queen Amatachetto was from the Nubian people, and she is one of the great queens that they said she came from a line of Kandaki um, queens. So this is like when a king has, he dies and then his son is to the throne. His son, well, she came from a lineage like that of queens. Now, and they also said that she also became popular because she had her own pyramid that had a lot of gold and jewelry inside or on the pyramid itself. And that was a sign back then of how much wealth you had. If you had your gold and your diamonds or your jewelry on your pyramid or in your pyramid. Now, and she was also known for defeating a Roman army. How about that? A Roman army. So women were getting busy, from amongst these legacies. We find those kind of queens that, they understood they had to get a job done and they put their lives on the line for themselves, their people, and their land. Now, this was during the time of Augusta and the Roman Empire, in which her mother was part of that succession of queens that made the treaties between um, the Nubians and Augusta. Number six is the famous Queen Sheba. Queen Sheba. And she's one of the most legendary queens of all times, mentioned in light of all of the Abrahamic faiths, they call it, meaning the Jews, the Christians, and of course the Muslims. And she's in the famous story of King Solomon, which is known to be Suleiman in Arabic, the prophet and son of the prophet and messenger Dawood, known as David. So David is the father of Solomon, which is Suleiman, and Suleiman is connected to the story of Queen Sheba. Queen Sheba, when it comes to uh, a legend, then her legend even goes outside of Africa. In all parts of the world, she's known. She has more than one name as it relates to Hebrew. Then they call her, Queen Sheba. And the Arabs, they understand from the story her to be Bilqis, yani, as Allah mentioned her in the Quran. The Muslims know her by both Queen Sheba, but the Arabs know her by Bilqis. That's just the Arabic name for her. And and the people of Kenya call her Nukuti. Nukuti. And the Ethiopians themselves call her Queen Makeda. So you see, this is the legendary Queen Sheba, and we understand that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has informed us that she accepted Islam and that she is from amongst those that had a large kingdom, and Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala named one of the surahs in the Quran after her, dedicating the story of her in the Quran. Ya Asantawa, coming in at number five. She comes from the Ashanti Empire, which is connected to the famous West African country, Ghana. She is one of the queens of war and that which is of military command, and she led the army against the British in the 20th century. Yeah, Asantewa, what makes her so unique, one of the things that makes her so well known and popular is the intelligence and the political impact that she had on her people. And this is something that we still have in the different books and in the different places in Ghana. You can find writings about her. And one of the main stories is that when the British they exiled the king of Ghana during her time, she actually in one of the meetings stood up and she was talking to the Asante tribe, the men of that tribe, and she mentioned the quote, "Now I see that some of you, meaning the men of the Asante tribe, you fear going forward to fight to liberate the king that the British had exiled." She said if this was in the days of the brave Osei Tutu, which is one of the tribes of Ghana, and he was one of the great kings, Osei Tutu, or Kunfa, or Poco Red, which these are names of great leaders of Ghana, then they would have took care of business. They wouldn't have just sat down as people who were heads of the tribes and allowed the king to be exiled and taken away without even lifting a finger or firing a shot. She said no European could have did the chiefs of Asante the way that the governors disrespected you all. They would never have tolerated that kind of talk. And then she challenged them. She said, "Is it true that the bravery, the courage of the Sante men has left? It's over, no more." And then she said, "I can't believe this. Therefore, if the men don't go and stand up from the Asante tribe and fight to free the king, to bring him out of exile," and she said, "I will gather all of my sisters, all of the women. We will go and we will fight. And we will fight all of them. The fellow women will fight till the last of us drops dead in the battlefield." Those kind of words and the imploring speech of the queen, then it incited the men and gave them morale to stand up and to go fight to liberate their king that the British put in exile. So this is like what we know. Some of the women in different places are known to have this type of power, and she's known to this day in Ghana for this historical event. The number fourth queen is Queen Asinga. A Queen Asinga is from Angola, and this is a very um, prominent queen, and she actually raised wage and raised the fight against the Portuguese who came to take over her land. And it's an amazing story. I heard it from a documentary that's very lengthy, and one of the things that was amazing that when the Portuguese came to do conquering, and part of what they wanted to do was to gain territory so they could engage in the slave trade. Then, she fought against them, but she also used some diplomatical strategies, and two of them stand out. One, she made um, a pact with the Dutch because the Dutch were trying to get the land from one perspective, and the Portuguese were trying to get the land from another perspective. So she figured that if she make allies with the Dutch, then the Dutch could help her against the other European counterparts. And the second thing was that she ended up accepting Catholicism, because by doing that, then she could have help from those people that were the Christians, the Catholics, rather than have them as enemies against her. So she was politicking. And what happened was, in the end, after I think 30, about 30, about 30 years of fighting against the Portuguese, and she was one of the people that also directly fought in the battle. After about 30 years, then she was uh, she was uh, uh, after about 30 years, then she died, and they tried to kill her many times. But one of the things that was interesting is that any slaves that fled to her area, she would give them refuge. She was a person that would make a place for the runaway slaves. Now, so this Queen Azinka, then she was eventually defeated because the Dutch, as the Europeans normally do, like the British and the French, they sided with one another against her, because they knew that the benefit was for them, if they got her out of the way, then they can go further into the interior. Further into the interior means more slaves, more money. So that's how that played out. But she was very well respected, uh, Queen Zinga, in history, as it relates to this issue of fighting and war and waging war against the Portuguese. Now, this at one point, she sent some gold spears. Number Queen of Monitoria. Queen of Monitoria says she was another Nubian queen. So you have a lot of Nubian queens. And she actually helped build ancient Kush. She actually helped build ancient Kush, which is important. And they said this queen, she's also the grandmother of King Tut. So she not only helped build uh, ancient Kush, but she's also the grandmother of King Tut. And she had a lot to do with foreign relation. Also, number two was King Tai. King Tai. King Tai is a figure that she's actually, they wrote books about her as it relates to Egyptian history because she had a strong political game. And this is again the grandmother of King Tut. We used to watch the cartoons and Three Stooges and different movies, King Tut, but that was a real king in Egypt. And they even have what's supposed to be a so-called tomb of his in the Egyptian Museum there in Cairo. I remember seeing that back in 2005. So this was very, uh, and she also was one of the advisors to her own husband uh, of that era. And this is something that they kind of talk about as it relates to the devotion and the relationship, because most marriages back then were strictly political, but this one had not only a political twist to it but a romantic twist. And this is King Tai, who was the grandmother of King Tut. Now the husband, he not only honored her by making different shrines to honor her after her death, but he also made a artificial lake in commemoration of her. And this is something that you don't see in these days and times, when the women bond with the husband and they work together in different things and they become famous. Normally, the man, he might sleep with somebody else and leave her, or he might try to take all the riches, or But you see this kind of story, says, wow, this is not only political dedication between the husband and the wife, but also on the side of devotion, friendship, and as we said, romance. Now, and this was one of the greatest queens of the Nubian queens, to the point that even made her like a goddess, a Lamustan, where they will worship her, Queen Tai. Subhanallah. And some people, they wrote about Queen Tai. They said the unprecedented thing about her was not where she came from, but what she accomplished. And that's very profound, because, like I say, it's not where you're from, but it's where you're at. We have that saying. Yeah. Subhanallah. So that's Queen Tai. And the number one that they that they shows uh, the we said uh, that this may not be in order with everybody's book, but this particular uh, this historian, the way he put them in order, then the one that he chose for number one is a Queen of Moderitas, and she's a Nubian. As you find, the Nubians had a lot of queens, ancient Nubia, and and some say she's the most popular Nubian queen from amongst the queens. So this, when you talk about 10 African queens, that not only they were queens, but you see they were very involved politically, and to the point that they were fighting and on the battlefield, and trying to liberate and freeing slaves and pushing out the colonialists, and making legislation and rallying the morale of the men, when they became low, to not give up. This is a part of history that we don't hear. And a lot of times, if we do hear something of history from Africa, then it's that women were running around half naked with bone in their nose, and or, or that they said behind every great man was a strong woman. But some of these women, they led the civilizations, as you can see, and that's just 10 that were picked. If somebody else will write, he might pick 20. He might change the order. It depends, you see. But I thought this was interesting, and it would be something that um, is part of lost or hidden knowledge that would make a difference when you hear the different uh, stories about Africa, and in a time where we live now, where people need to have uplifting. And so now what time is it now?
Oh, it's 17 after.
Hmm?
17 after.
Okay, quite, alhamdulillah. So now, if we just look at that part, which we were talking about women who were queens, and they were African queens, and how they were instrumental in the issue of fighting in the society and their great contributions, then the other misconception is you don't hear that most of the time when you talk about African history and contributions of women and Africans in general. Then the other part is that those people that came with the Atlantic slave trade, most of the time people, again, they say that these people were all non-Muslim. And they don't talk about the Muslims that were enslaved, nor do they talk about the contribution to Islam that the Africans made. They don't talk about the contribution that the Africans made to al-Islam. So I thought that was interesting. And you have some people that when they talk about this issue, then you have to understand what was the first contact with the Muslims when they came to North America. So Sheikh Abdul Hakim Quick, to me, he is one of the strongest authorities on this. So I took some, quotes from him, question and answers. And so one of the things that was asked of him, he said, why is it that Muslims, us, when we hear about slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, we just think of black people that were brought over here, stolen from their homelands. They were brought to, places like the Caribbean, South America, what's considered North America. And you don't really see the pain or the grieving from the Muslims when it comes to that issue, except that those Muslims are African American, but you don't see it from the Muslims at large. So the Sheikh, he was asked why. So the Sheikh, he said, welcome salam. The Sheikh, he said, replying to this, that the way that the image has been portrayed to the Muslims from a Western perception, this is one of the main reasons why. And if it was the Muslims looking at the Muslims from other parts of the world, then of course they would grieve if it's from Palestine or Burma or India. But when it comes to the Muslims that happen to from Africa, you don't find the Muslims grieving or caring. So the Sheikh said most of it, it's because of the way that the Muslims look at this issue, which is from a European perspective. And one of them is that they don't differentiate between those Muslims who were involved with the East African slave trade after the Prophet ﷺ as it relates to slavery during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They try to equivocate them together. And we know that the Muslims by that time of the East African slave trade, they had deviated from what Prophet came with, because Islam came to eradicate and to take the slavery away. That's why we have so many injunctions in the Quran that you have to free a slave. And so, this was a way of minimizing to get rid of slavery during the time of the Prophet. And also the Shaikh Abdul Hakim, Dr. Abdul Hakim Quick, he said, and there were no slave raids by the Muslims during the time of the Prophet. They came much later. And he said one of the ways we know that the Atlantic slave trade is not like the slave trade of those Muslims that were trading on the coast of East Africa, he said, because when you look at the Americas, when you look at Brazil, when you look at Venezuela, when you look at Dominican Republic, and you could see the descendants of the slaves. You could see black people, right? You see them. He said, but if you look at Kuwait, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Saudi Arabia, if the slave trade was exactly the same, then where the black people at? You don't see the proof. You don't see the numbers. So that's one proof to show that there's no comparison between the Atlantic slave trade and the East African slave trade that was between the Arabs and the Africans. The Shaikh, he also mentioned, that's deep. The Shaikh, he also mentioned that that some of the first people to enslave the Africans were the Portuguese and the Spanish. I'll make these 3 points and I'll finish. He said, and when you hear the Maroonies, he said this term maroon came from the revolt of the Africans that was in Jamaica. He said they were called Samarooni. He said, and Samarooni means a wild horse. So they gave the name Maroon because they were wild, meaning they revolted. And he said this whole thing where slavery used to be a class thing, the Atlantic slave trade, what the European did, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they changed it from a commodity to a color. So he said one of the worst things that they could have done was strip the people from their language, strip them from their names, strip them from their religion. And he said they would separate, a woman, a man, and her children. He said, and they said you're now Negroid, and this meant black, the word Negroid. So you're not even a people no more, you're just a color. He said, and this was part of the dehumanization of those people. He said, and it worked. You could see the long-lasting effects of that, to today. He said, and that's why when you see somebody's name is Williams or Douglas, these are names of the slave master. He said, and so everybody that belonged to that slave master, it will have a French name or a British name or a Spanish name or a Portuguese name like this. He said, and they would change the names of the Muslim. He said there's some scholars that came here. He mentioned a lot of them. I'll mention just a few and then we'll end. He said like Abu Bakr. He said the West Indian people, astaghfirullah, the West African people, they would say Babakr for Abu Bakr, Babakr. He said and Babakr became Booker, like Booker T. Mm-hmm. He said, and there was a large family called the Bilalians. And he said, it was Muhammad Bilali and, his brothers. He said, so the first thing they did was change Bilali to Bella, the Bella, like Bella. And he said, then they changed it from Bella to Bailey. He says, so anybody you see with the name Bailey, know that wasn't a slave name. That name, they have to be connected to the Bilali family. Because no slaves owners had the name Bailey. That was a tailored name. And he said also you'll find like great scholars came here. I'll mention these three and we'll stop. The one of them he mentioned was Abdurrahman. You know the prince, right?
Yeah.
And he said that the Moroccan government was the first to acknowledge America as a country. So the treaty was any Moors, which also included the term any Muslim, any Moors that you find that's they can read, write, they're literate, any indication that they are Moors, you have to free them. So that's how Abdul Rahman he got freed. So his writings end up getting in a newspaper, and once it reached the government, they had to free him. You also had Umar Said. Umar Said, he was a great scholar, and they said that he was forced to accept Christianity, but he accepted Christianity, but he was still like practices Islam secretly, and many of his writings you can find his whole biography now in the Library of Congress here in the United States since 2017, and they kind of pieced it together. Scholars who knew Arabic, to kind of preserve his biography and his writings, and that was the thing that earned him his freedom too. Because once they seen how literate he was and how well he knew Arabic, they knew that he had to be free. So this is showing you the benefit of knowledge. It freed a lot of people. And then you had Ayub bin Suleiman. They named him Job bin Solomon. And what I found interesting about this, and then we're in, is that not only he was brought into slavery here in the Americas, but in the beginning, he was a slave owner himself. I found that from another documentary. Sheikh Abdul Hakim did mention that point. He was a slave owner. And what happened was he went to the market to do some trading, and they grabbed him, put him on the ship, and once he got here and seen the treatment, he realized, man, this is horrible. Now he's anti-slavery. And it was only his writings as well and his literacy that got him freed, and he went back home to his country. So, the point here is that when you talk about Africa, from the queens that we mentioned, there used to be warriors, and some of them were Muslim, some of them weren't. And you talk about the theory, the misconception that all of the slaves that came here from West and Central Africa, they were non-Muslims. That's only to say because the Muslims were involved in slavery. No, Muslims came here. Some of them scholars. Many of them, freed because of the treaties between Morocco and America, if they were to find any Moors, meaning a term for Muslims back then in the government, that they would have to free them because of the peace treaty between America and Morocco. And this, we hope, inspires people to increase themselves in knowledge, increase themselves in the world awareness of the history of not only the Africans, but the Arabs, the Europeans, as it relates to slavery and its pros and cons, and the issue of women that were successful not only as queens but leaders of whole armies, and how they fought against colonization and freeing of their people and their country. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين.